The title of this is Planet Earth, Her People, Their History, and the Current Dilemma. Part 2, Zechariah, Sitchin, Enlil, and Enki. In the late 1970s, Zechariah Sitchin began writing a series of books about the Sumerian culture. In those books, he talked about extraterrestrials having come to Earth for the purpose of mining gold, and were dealing with primitive humans who were helping them to accomplish this. In Sitchin's story, there were two sons of those extraterrestrials. The sons were named Enlil and Enki, and they were somewhat competitive with one another. For reasons that were not clear to me in the story, Enlil ended up being the favorite son of his father and was chosen to rule. Enki was portrayed as being an excellent engineer, very capable, and working very hard to help the people build roads and canals, but he was secondary. When the Great Flood occurred, Enlil and Enki withdrew to their ship, and almost all of the humans died except for Noah and his family. While certain names and concepts in this story did exist, and some of the events did occur, the story presented by Sitchin is not exactly as it happened. The following information comes from the holographic records shared by the people from Apelos, deep in the earth. And they say the real story starts nearly 433,000 years ago, when a particular stellar alignment occurs between a group of stars, causing the stellar rays from each star in the group to converge onto one small planet, the planet Earth. This convergence of energies sparks the ability of carbon atoms to form a wider variety of covalent bonds. The group of stars that gradually moved into the powerful alignment was known as the EI group. And over the next 10,000 years, there was a gradual change in the DNA of the primate life forms on the planet. Although very subtle, the DNA changes began to accelerate the evolution of those primates, making them more dynamic and more sensitive. 10,000 years later, the effects of this stellar alignment had allowed the DNA and its features to evolve and build out within a small group of primates to the fullest degree. Following that, they continued to develop naturally and normally for another 50,000 years. And then a series of events occurred that would change everything. Around 372,500 years ago, a space war in our solar system caused considerable damage to a Syrian ship. The big ship was named the Nibiru, and it needed metal ores for repairs, especially gold. The ship was only a little smaller than our moon, so this was a long process of shuttling groups of Syrian workers in small ships to the surface of the earth to mine ores from the area of the Arabian Peninsula. The Syrians were not well adapted to our atmosphere and could only work for short periods of time each day before having to return to their ship to recover. While working here, they noticed the curiosity of some of the big primates who were watching them from a distance. And one day, Tenakau, the man leading the mining operation, got the idea that perhaps the Syrians could get help from those primates. They, the primates, were perfectly adapted to the Earth environment, and they seemed curious about the mining operation, but were quite fearful. The Syrians were experts at using frequencies, and Tenneco's thought was to broadcast frequencies that would eliminate any fear held by the primates, allowing the Syrians to perhaps teach them how to help with the mining. The Nibiru also positioned itself in our solar system in such a way that it was able to emit specific frequencies that would further advance and accelerate the development of the small group of primates they were targeting. This effort worked. And now the DNA in the group of primates targeted took on the designation of EN. In other words, when extraterrestrials make a change, they record that. Everything is tracked and recorded very carefully. As Tenneco and the ship continued to broadcast frequencies of joy, not only did the primates enjoy the work, but this state of emotional joy further refined and upgraded their DNA. Tenneco was keeping the ship's commander and the doctors on board the Nibiru informed of what he was doing, probably because advanced civilizations with an ethical orientation are very conscious of how precious life is, and they would not have wanted to harm the primates. The doctors then suggested that they create a group of clones using some of the DNA from the more evolved primates who had responded well in the EN frequency group. This was also successful. When their success in accelerating the development of the primates was reported to the wise council on their home planet, they received permission to combine Syrian DNA with primate DNA. They were then ordered to keep going with the project to develop the primates here and to support all activities that would result in an evolved being on this planet in the future. Over the next 1,500 years, the Syrians continued to work here, and while doing so, did extensive crossbreeding and genetic modification to develop clones that could not only help with mining and repairs to the ship, but would eventually also be able to hold the advanced consciousness of someone from the Syrian civilization. To accomplish this, the Syrians began to study various stellar configurations and genetic outcomes, looking for the exact moment in time and space in which they could create a powerful effect on the DNA of the EN primates. They settled on two possible stellar configuration moments and then used both of them to impact the target DNA. The result was two distinct lines of DNA development. One was designated the ENL group and the other was the ENK group. So you can see, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and L. The K and L are just two designations that say, okay, these guys have had further modification. Those in the ENL group had an energy field that was quite large and very refined, with a wide range of frequencies. They were quite tall. Many had platinum blonde hair and green or blue eyes. And they were able to be comfortable and to move easily through both the physical and etheric levels. They lived very long lives, hundreds of years, and spent much of it in a state of joy, which further advanced their consciousness, although they could not procreate. Because of the refinement of their DNA, the ENL group was able to enter dimensions that had a much higher frequency. They were able to communicate easily with the people from Sirius or other star systems, and they often lived around the Syrian bases and worked together with them. The ENL line was highly prized for further hybridization with Syrian DNA, and by 371,000 BC, the goal of the Syrians was finally reached. Tenakov's consciousness was successfully copied into a body that could hold the high frequencies of Sirian consciousness. Their first successful model was named Adam. And to this day, our religions have kept this name in their creation stories. However, there were many more versions that were needed to refine this new human, many more versions before they were able to create a viable woman, and still more versions before these prototypes were able to reproduce. Their offspring received ongoing evolutionary frequencies being transmitted by the doctors on the Nibiru, thus creating a steady improvement in the consciousness of this line. The ENL group became known eventually as the NL line, and eventually this became the Enlil group. The ENK group had a different set of circumstances. These people were much shorter, more muscular. Their energy field was much smaller and coarser, and they were quite hairy. Their frequencies were not as extensive or refined, leaving them unable to access the dimensions having higher ranges of frequency that were part of the etheric level. Because of the low level of frequency in the ENK bodies, Sirians and other extraterrestrials could not incarnate in them, nor could they communicate easily with them. Those born into the ENK bodies were restricted to only the physical level of existence. Since they could not see or communicate with the more highly evolved beings, they could not understand the need to develop themselves so that they too could enter the God state. As a result, they preferred to worship their own assortment of gods and used wealth, sex, and control as their goals in life. For these reasons, this group was mostly ignored by the Sirians when it came to further research and development. The ENK branch continued to evolve at its own natural pace without any further help from highly evolved DNA or external intervention. They became known as the NK group and eventually the NK group. And they did the great majority of physical labor needed by the Sirians who built whole cities here in order to continue their research. The Enki were much more sexually active and soon outnumbered the Enlil beings. There was an effort to keep the two groups apart, but this was not followed, and there was a considerable amount of sexual activity between the Enki branch and the Enlil branch, along with some concern that the high consciousness of the ENL group would be brought down by the ENK group. This did not happen, and a great diversity of DNA continued to expand. Once stable forms of the new human had been created for the Earth, a number of other extraterrestrial races who were in full support of the project began arriving to help stabilize the new civilization by incarnating in the new bodies as they became available. People migrated to Earth from Sirius, Arcturus, the Pleiades, Andromeda, the Centauri systems, and beyond. As time went on, many civilizations rose and fell, some being mainly physical, others being based in some of the higher frequencies of the etheric realm, and some comfortable in both. In practical terms, this meant that people of lower frequency mixed daily with those of higher frequencies. In other words, people based in the third, fourth, and fifth dimensions lived together, built third, fourth, and fifth dimensional cities, and moved back and forth among them without difficulty. There were a number of people with greater sensitivity to frequencies who were able to recognize locations on the planet where you could walk through a frequency portal and find yourself in another location on the planet or in another dimension of people and be quite comfortable there and knew how to return. This meant that those who maintained higher frequencies could move back and forth from the physical dimension to the etheric dimension without a great deal of difficulty. For thousands of years, this ability to enter and be comfortable in the cities of varying etheric densities was common. However, as the population of humans grew, so did the wars of those with lower frequencies. Those with higher consciousness would often seek refuge from the fighting in the quiet, peaceful cities of those with higher frequencies. The etheric city that we are most familiar with, perhaps some of us, is the city of Shambhala. Up until about 27,500 years ago, it was part of Earth and was simply a region where people of high frequency consciousness lived in peace and simple abundance. However, as the frequency of Earth fell due to the expansion of many conflicts over physical property, resources, gods, and control, Shambhala and other high frequency locations began to withdraw from contact. Over a period of several thousand years, there was less and less moving back and forth between the two dimensions. And by 25,000 BC, Shambhala was completely disconnected from the physical plane. There were now only two ways to get to Shambhala. One was to raise the frequency of your consciousness deliberately, and the other was to accidentally stumble through one of the frequency distortions that allowed immediate access. Shambhala still exists and is populated by highly advanced beings, having a greatly evolved consciousness, and who hold the hope that those still on the surface of Earth will reach a high degree of spirituality and the technological development that goes with that spirituality. Other fourth dimensional cities are still in contact with us. They hold the same hope, but they stay carefully hidden. And they have developed extraordinary technologies and use energy systems to block access to their locations. After all these thousands of years and the slow, messy, but ongoing development of the ENK branch of humanity, those who first seeded us are astounded at our sturdy reliance, our ability to adapt, and our slow but sure evolution of consciousness. Where we were at first relatively ignored and left to survive the best we could, now we are watched, supported, and helped. The help is not necessarily overt and obvious, but it has become clear to those of the highest councils that we represent the possibility of becoming beings who are highly evolved and also very accomplished as physical beings. Since most evolution of consciousness results in enlightenment and the transformation to a body of light, the idea of a people who maintain their physicality, yet reach the powerful stages of the God state, is rather rare. And yet it is what we are being guided toward. The hope is that we will someday travel the stars and nurture other physical dimensions that are just getting started or just waking up. And I'm going to close by reading a couple pages from Forgotten Genesis. This is part of the Transylvania series. And I want to read it as a reminder to pay attention to the subtleties of life on this physical planet. And this is reading from pages 72 to 74. This should give you an idea of the kind of world we live in and that we can become aware of and sensitive to. It's kind of an interesting story. In a German city, there was a very old house built almost 300 years ago. Having been rebuilt and renovated several times, it somehow kept its late medieval appearance. The problem was that it was in a demolition area where a large park was planned. The surrounding buildings, all very old, had already begun to be demolished, but that house was well defended by property law. Besides, it also had a historical protection status. Discussions, proposals, and even legal proceedings had gone on for many years, but no one had ever seen the owner. Lawyers said that he was always abroad, being an important businessman who did not want to sell or give up that old building. In the legal papers, it appeared that he had inherited the property, with all of the other papers referring to the descendant. It seemed to be a problem with no solution. At one point, the city officials asked the police to do some discreet research because, despite the efforts of state officials, they were unable to contact the owner of the house to conduct direct talks and negotiations. Any such dealings at the order of the owner were to be done only through the law firm. After a time, however, things became very strange. Taking advantage of the cameras already fitted for the future park, discreet observation of that house began. The reports indicated that it was not inhabited during the first 4 months of 2005. Then, at the end of April, the first person, possibly the owner, went inside and came out only 4 days later. In the summary note received from a colleague, the police report stated that the man who had entered had no luggage and wore only a raincoat over his clothes. There were obviously no goods in the house because it had remained uninhabited for months. Even so, the man did not go out until 4 days afterwards. The police became suspicious and informed the BND, some sort of a Secret Service organization, believing that the situation contained a certain risk of terrorism or other dangerous actions. The observation of the house continued, but this time with superior technique and Secret Service personnel dedicated specifically to that operation. The house was again deserted. But in just 2 months, another person, a tall, brown-haired man with a backpack, was seen entering it. The team carefully monitored the house for the next 7 days without seeing lights, movement, or other people entering or going out. Intrigued by the unusual situation, the head of the team made the decision to penetrate the inside. Additional outside help was called upon for observation, and the German team ended up being 10 in number. On the other side of the ocean, the situation was slightly different. While the Germans merely observed a building, the FBI actually chased a suspect. He was a tall, brown-haired man with unnaturally white skin who did not appear in any civil or visa records of the United States, but he had been involved in a particular accident. He had been sporadically observed from 2003 to 2005 in various cities on the East Coast of America, but each time he was lost. The case was solved in 2005 when an alert was given that the person had suddenly appeared in Detroit, whereupon he was arrested. The FBI team, however, wanted to closely follow the subject to see if he had any associates. Additional trigger forces had been mobilized so that the character could no longer disappear, as had happened before. The man was traced to a house in a neighborhood near the outskirts of the city, where he entered alone. A special FBI intervention team of 7 members then arrived and were strategically placed around the building. What developed from that point precipitated even more confusion. Reading the American report, Radu, the man writing this, says, I have a global vision of what happened there, but none of the parties involved, neither the Germans or the Americans, knew each other. When 6 members of the German team, they're back in Germany now, entered the old Bavarian house, they found no one there. The rooms were large enough, measuring about 3 meters high, and were modestly furnished. 4 of the German agents walked into the middle of the house through a hallway that led them into a room that was larger than the others and that was placed perpendicular to the direction from which they had entered. On the opposite wall, they saw an ordinary door located exactly at the center of that wall. The only strange aspect was that on the side of the door facing them, there were ingrained stones on the wall that were just like those from a river at the base of the house. The German agents then became tense as they heard voices on the other side of the door, addressing them in English in a very commanding tone. The US report mentions the hot part of the operation as follows, quote, the German team violently broke the wooden door between the 2 rooms, being prepared for automatic weapons. Our team, more specifically 3 of the 4 agents who entered the house, also had their weapons on the door because we heard voices giving orders in the German language. They had 4 agents and we had 3. At first, we all screamed at each other to drop the guns. But in all of that tension and agitation, neither side could understand anything. Then we suddenly stopped because we were all stunned. The German and American operatives were facing each other after finding each other in a large but completely empty room. What follows is a fragment from the summary of the German report, according to what the team commander said. I looked in the room from behind one of the windows. It was evening and was raining hard. Our clothes and equipment were getting wet. When I turned my head to view through the window inside the empty room where the American agents were, I saw it was noontime. The sun was shining in a blue sky. None of us could articulate a word. I knew that the images were being transmitted in real time, but everyone was silent during those moments. The surprise was colossal. In the report, it was mentioned that when agents were at the broken door, that is, when interacting with interdimensional space, the image was distorted, but it was still possible to distinguish what was going on there. And after the portal was entered, the images returned to normal. Obviously, that house contained an actual portal, a distortion. That is a spatial portal between 2 worlds, one side in Germany, one side in Detroit. So there's more, but I'll end it there. I just want you to understand that if you can pay attention, be a little more sensitive to the world around you, there are what I call portals, distortions. I call them hybrid areas that you can move through. and be somewhere else on the planet, or in some other planet altogether. So I will close there. Let's move on to the next part.